Hello and a very warm welcome to the session on From Large Language Models to Learning Companions. My name is Hassan Khosravi and I'm an Associate Professor of AI and Education at the University of Queensland. It's a real pleasure to have you join us here today. I'm joined by three distinguished guests, hopefully the third one joining us soon, Professor Jason Lodge and Dr. Aneesha Bakharia, both from the University of Queensland, and Peter Xing from Microsoft, who I'll probably introduce in just a few moments. Let's start by doing a bit of a setting of the scene for the session. Over the past few years, we've seen this extraordinary surge in generative AI tools, especially large language models or LLMs such as ChatGPT, Gemini, and Copilot. And these tools are transforming knowledge work in ways that go far beyond earlier forms of automations that we've seen. In the past, automation was mostly about replacing repetitive, routine tasks, things that required little cognitive effort, like replacing cashiers in supermarkets. But LLMs have been quite different. They reach right at the heart of tasks that require high cognitive ability, like writing, analyzing, programming, and even decision making. And in doing so, they're not just automating labor, but they're essentially augmenting human intelligence, which is bringing us to this new form of hybrid intelligence paradigm, where humans and AI systems work together to improve quality of work and also productivity, each contributing what they do best. AI sort of brings the speed, scale, and the precision, with human bringing in context, ethical reasoning, and creativity. There is growing evidence, empirical evidence, that shows this partnership tends to work well. For example, GitHub Copilot users finish coding tasks more than 50% faster. In customer service and consulting, AI supports not only boost efficiency, but also helps less experienced staff perform close to expert levels. And a survey of around 5,000 US workers across disciplines showed that 30% of these workers use AI almost on a daily basis, and they think that it makes them 3 times more productive. A task that would have taken them 90 minutes to do without AI, they would tend to do in 30 minutes if they are using AI. The rapid advancement of LLMs is also reshaping education, where students are using AI in many aspects of their learning, from idea generation to using it as a tutor for better understanding of the concepts of the course, and at times simply for completing their assessments, which has introduced this learning performance paradox, which we'll talk a lot more about. But evidence shows that AI tools can improve academic performance and engagement, but their ease of use also risks fostering over-reliance, metacognitive laziness, and diminishing learning and learner agency, which are all things that we're trying to avoid. So while AI tools can undoubtedly boost short-term performance, a real challenge has been, and the focus of today's session and discussion is going to be, how do we move out of AI for performing tasks and productivity to AI that promotes learning? With that, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists who bring different expertise and complementary views to this discussion. Professor Jason Lodge is one of the leading voices on this topic. He is a professor of educational psychology at the University of Queensland and the director of the Learning, Instruction and Technology Lab. His work explores the cognitive and emotional mechanisms of learning within digital environments, addressing critical questions on how technology, particularly AI, is shaping education. Dr. Aneesha Bakharia is a senior lecturer at the University of Queensland with research centered on AI-assisted coding, AI literacy, and the integration of AI into learning tools. Have we had Peter join us yet?
Not that I can see. No, sorry.
I might wait and introduce him when he comes in. During the session, we would also love to hear your perspectives throughout the session. Please feel free to post your questions, your comments on both the platform Whova or directly here through Zoom. And during the Q&A segment, we'll draw on some of your contributions to guide and enrich our discussion. Jason, I might start with you. One of your recent publications is a commentary in Nature Review Psychology on distinguishing performance gains from learning when using generative AI. Could you perhaps share your key points on that work and why this distinction is for education?
Thanks, Hassan. It's great to be here. I'm, as you are, in Meanjin on the Maiwar, otherwise known as Brisbane on the Brisbane River, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of these lands. It's a great question, Hassan, and something that obviously we've been thinking about for some time. Even back before we had generative AI as part of the mix, it was pretty clear, I think, that most of our education systems are set up with this kind of input-output model. So we put some things in, and at the end we get students who have got admission ranks to tertiary, or we get a GPA. In fact, many of the ways that we think about what we think of in higher education in particular is we think about things like learning outcomes. What is the outcome that we are aiming for here? But learning is not just about outcomes. Learning is also a process. So this is where I think we've been caught out a little bit by the way that AI has allowed students and many of us to be able to get to outcomes without going through the process. So one of the ways that I've been talking about this in the past, and I know that there are a million metaphors out there about AI and how we might explain the impact that it's having, but I kind of think, and one that is still helpful in my mind, is that it's sort of like an e-bike, right? So an e-bike will help you get to a destination. That's fine. You can get there. But if you're using an e-bike to get fit, then getting the e-bike to do all the work is not going to get you fit. And ultimately, our job as educators, I think, in education systems, is to help our students be fit in their minds. So if the AI is just getting the students to the end point without us being very clear about what the impact is on the process and the important work that has to go into that process, there is, I think, a significant risk that the work that has to happen to help students to become fit in their learning and in their thinking is going to be offloaded or going to be missed. You know, at the end of the day, learning is about a process as well as the outcome. So we need to be mindful of both of these things in the equation, and that's really what the paper is getting at.
Thanks for that. Aneesha, let me turn to you. You've been developing educational tools for the last 15 years, much before AI and generative AI were actually as hot as they are now. How do you see generative AI enabling new forms of interaction and engagements that perhaps weren't possible in the kind of tools that you were creating, 10 years ago?
Thank you, Hassan. Really pleased to be part of this panel and this discussion here today. So currently I'm an academic, but in a prior lifetime, as you said, I actually was a learning tools developer and manager of learning analytics. And a lot of that time was actually spent with learning designers and educators who were doing wholly online courses. And it was coming in as the developer and building learning tools to facilitate the learning and the processes that they wanted to incorporate in their courses. I guess I feel upbeat in this perspective because I think now it's easier than ever for them, educators, learning designers, to be building and designing their own tools just by describing them and being able to test them. And the classic example I like to give on a tool I really like is Anthropic Claude's Artifacts. And so I think about 2 months ago, it came out and it wasn't just able to build what I would term a traditional learning tool. It was actually able to incorporate AI into what it was building and generating. So this is where it could call itself to get feedback based on what a student had entered. You could start looking at a lot of the traditional computer-supported collaborative learning setups, where you could have users contributing and AI then also coming into that sort of piece of work. And so I see a lot of potential, but key things here is that we need to give this technology to our educators, our learning designers, and give them some ability to be creative about actually building these new tools that can support learning as a process inside there. And there needs to be a lot more experimentation in terms of the user interface on these particular things, where we move away from the current question, give me an answer straight away models. But there are challenges along this pathway too, because there's a lot of this is available commercially, and I'm obviously paying for this and putting in API keys. But that same technology, while it's available, it's not in the tools that we're giving educators daily. It's not something that they can easily just release to their students at the moment. So we have some challenges there.
Thank you. Peter, delighted to have you join us. Welcome on board. Peter is Cloud and AI Lead for Education at Microsoft. He helps institutions prioritize high-impact AI use cases and accelerate projects through Microsoft's platforms and partner ecosystems from proof of concept all the way to production. Peter, you probably have a bird's eye view of the sector and in terms of what's been happening, how LLMs are currently being embedded into educational tools, including Microsoft's own platforms such as Teams, but also perhaps what you're seeing in the broader ecosystem. If you can give us your insights.
Yeah, definitely, Hassan. Thank you so much for having me. And it's great to be on a panel with Jason and Aneesha. Apologies, it's a little bit late. But yeah, just I work across the universities, New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland, and also the departments of education. So we're seeing that last 3 years of the journey from banning to then banning the banning of AI in the classroom. And yeah, I think a lot of the universities have already embedded Azure, OpenAI into their own solutions. So that's things like University of Sydney's Cogniti solution, as well as what UTS have done with Recast, and also Macquarie Uni with their virtual peer. And in Western Sydney Uni at the moment, and they're going on that AI journey now as well, looking at the entire student journey end to end, from induction all the way to going through the courses with agentic AI to help them with the tutoring, but also post-work. Going into the workforce, having access to Teams is something that you do in your day-to-day lives, in your business and professional life. So having that familiar access to AI, starting with something like Teams with Copilot Chat, and embedding these Azure AI solutions that have been developed by the universities and the K-12 departments into Teams, really is getting the students more familiar and just using this as almost like another companion, another peer of them, like at Macquarie Uni. And so I think seeing that adoption in the last 3 years now, it's at that maturity curve where they're changing the way, not the pedagogical state, but also how that's going to expand to the broader student life cycle. So that's what's really exciting, because it means it's a reinvention of the business model for the university as well. From just teaching and learning to expanding that out to, who knows, over the next year or so, the rate that these LLMs and AIs are developing, we could get to the point of like post-labor economics. So, why not spend that at the university campuses and just enjoy life in first year forever? But yeah, really excited to explore that with the team here.
Thanks for that insights. There is a lot of innovation and technologies that are coming in. Is there perhaps anything you can talk to, Peter, that would have had a actual impact on day-to-day experience of students so far in terms of, what we're seeing happening?
Yeah, I think we did a case study with Macquarie Uni on the virtual peer, and they found that obviously the students having access to the virtual peer was super intense just before the exams. So you see like massive spikes before then. But they did a sort of A/B test of the students that were using this versus not using it, and they actually showed a 10% improvement in their marks. So that's the difference between a D to an HD student. So there's a real like life impact there. And also it helps the teachers actually get some sleep at night, because having that one-to-one relationship with the students and asking questions all the time, knowing that you could still have this digital stunt double to interact with the students always, and then seeing how they're interacting with it, doing follow-ups if you need to have that deeper guided learning. And we're seeing the University of New South Wales as well, using that as a way to look at academic success and making sure that they can proactively intervene where it helps students maybe go to that next level or just mitigate that risk of dropouts as well. So various of those. But more importantly, I think it's become so familiar with the students that are already interacting with ChatGPT every day, but also on the K-12 going into university or into tertiary, because they're used to using EduChat, which is going to be in New South Wales rolling out to all students from this month. And same with South Australia's EdChat in K-12. They're using that as their career advisor, and so that'll help them with their course selection. And also Queensland with Corella, off the back of what the Queensland Department has done, seeing that adoption across the K-12 students, and same with the Catholics and independents. It just becomes a norm. It becomes sort of a need to have embedding into your university student days.
Fabulous. Let me take you back to the main point of our discussion, which is learning companions, and how that might look different. And coming back, Jason, to your e-bikes, aspect of it's not about getting them to the final destination, but we actually want to get them fit for life and, for where they want to work. So if we step back, I think it's clear that, and we have a lot of, emerging evidence that large language models in their current form are optimized for productivity and augmentation of our capabilities rather than fostering deep learning, reflection, and learner agency. There are some exciting developments sort of on the horizon. For example, OpenAI and Gemini have themselves introduced study modes, which is sort of a type of using the same LLMs. It's being prompted to be a little bit more Socratic in terms of how it works. It guides your discovery rather than directly give you the answer. And one of the earlier systems we had was Khan Academy's Khan-Migo, which essentially was using the same idea of developing Khan-Migo as a Socratic AI tutor that aims to help students. However, essentially both of those are still limited in their ability to actually be a true learning companion that can support learning. It's worth remembering that AI-powered educational technologies aren't new. We've actually had over 4 decades of research on intelligent tutoring systems and adaptive learning platforms that have already shown how data-driven adaptivity can enhance learning outcomes. They've had their own limitations because it was essentially too costly to design these adaptive systems for various disciplines and aspects. So I guess one of the key questions is how can we build on this rich history of AI-powered educational technologies that we've had, the rigor and the pedagogical grounding in the learning sciences that it had, with what capabilities LLMs are providing. So Jason, bringing it back to you and perhaps drawing on psychology and past research on learning systems, what would be essential characteristics of an AI learning companion that can truly support learning rather than just shortcutting it?
Thanks, Hassan. I think there are some classics, and there was some great work that quite a few people were involved in looking at the lessons from the pandemic, for example. Right, so we went through this massive transition and everybody was online all of a sudden, and it was a real disruption to the way in which we had our education system set up. Unsurprisingly, I think, what floated to the top at the end of that were some of the things that we've known for a long time are really important in learning, that students feel they have agency, that they have a sense of purpose, that they're motivated, right? So all of these things we kind of knew were important, but there are elements also that came out that we realized we missed. You know, there is something about the way that humans learn with and from other humans that's really important. So to me, I think that the first part of this puzzle is what can we learn from that history that tells us what are the really critical components, no matter who or what it is that students are working with in the environments that they're in, that are going to help best facilitate their learning. Now, maybe some of those things might need to be tweaked as we learn more about how AI might interact with that and the ways in which it is playing out over time. But we do have a pretty solid foundation there, I think, to build from. Where I think it starts to get complicated is that, and I think Steve H has brought this up in the chat, is that it's going to look different in different contexts, right? And this has been one of the all-time challenges for the learning sciences is, okay, here are some general things that we see that are important for learning, but they're going to play out in very different ways depending on what the context is. And that, I think, is something that we need to keep in mind here. So if we think about the role that a learning companion might play, an important question to ask is, what does that tool do for what students need to do later in their life and in their work? Then think about, well, okay, how can we use this as a tool to meaningfully help develop the kinds of skills that students are going to need now and in the future? So I teach future teachers as one example, and there are some things that having an AI companion for is really, really helpful. Right? Coming up with a lesson plan, thinking about ways to get lessons to work for diverse groups of students, making adjustments to those lesson plans. Generative AI can come up with amazing ideas about all of those things. At the end of the day, though, my students, when they leave and go out into schools the next year, have to be the ones in the classroom as an embodied, enacted human being, helping to facilitate the learning of 25, 30, or in our case, for some of us, hundreds of other humans that have different prior knowledge and ways of thinking about the world. So how can we think meaningfully about what a learning companion might look like to help with the bits, firstly, that AI will be really useful for, like lesson planning for my students, but also how can it help to facilitate the more human parts that they're going to continue to need to do? right? Walking into a classroom and facilitating that learning for a bunch of children, young people or adults, it requires a level of embodiment and enacting ways of knowing and ways of being in the world that AI might be able to help scaffold. So that's where I could see the scaffolding fitting in and helping in that in terms of a learning companion. But at the end of the day, bringing it back to where I started, I think that has to be built on this notion that the things like agency and students feeling like they're part of the process and feeling like there is some sense of purpose to it all remain fundamental as part of that. So what we don't want to see, and I have seen some worrying trends in this direction, is that judgment, decision making, and those elements are taken away from students through the process, in that an AI says, oh, here's where we think you are and here's where we should go next. Actually, that decision making process is a really important part of the learning. So maybe not having that decision being made by the machine, but helping the students to be able to make better decisions themselves so that they can use that agency meaningfully and practice that process of making those decisions, I think is critical. The mistake that I think has happened with some of these technologies in the past is that they've taken too much of that agency away from students and from us more broadly. You know, social media being a good example. You don't really get to choose what comes up in your feed. That's a choice that's made by a machine, and we don't want to see that for learning, because those judgments and those decisions that are made through that learning process are really critical to develop the kind of thinking skills that are needed further down the track.
Really, really good points. To that point, a lot of the earlier adaptive learning systems and intelligent tutoring systems mostly worked as students learned from AI, because they would put out all the instructions and sort of the pathway you need to take, which is ideal for you, rather than learn with AI, where students would have some agency in terms of what they need to do. Open learner models and explainable AI was used as a way of at least explaining why we're asking students to do things, but that was mostly just to explain it to them rather than still give them agency to do it. And I think part of the discussion in redefining and rethinking what learning companions look like would to think about how you can actually be sort of helping students beside them rather than making these decisions for them. And I don't think we have examples of tools, at least I'm not aware of, in the past from our past intelligent tutoring systems and adaptive learning systems that have done that well. So good food for thought in terms of how we can design such models. The great questions coming both on Whova and Zoom, and we will get to more of your questions once we've gone through the first two parts of going through some of the questions that we've initially had, and then we'll sort of make a move over to the questions from the audience and participants. Aneesha, I want to take you back sort of to design perspectives and thinking of the tools you've developed before and sort of the possibilities, which is what's possible to do with generative AI now. What principles or frameworks do you think we need to take into consideration if we're building AI tools to ensure that they cultivate reflection, curiosity, and learner agency?
So for me, I think the most important thing actually picks up on some points that Jason has made. And just to pick up from some of the chat that's been happening also, if I were to look at the e-bikes metaphor, I think we're at a point where it's not even a person being on the bike. It can certainly autonomously go and have its own journey without the person. And if you look at some of the things that have been released, late last year, early this year, where it's, deep research tools. You can type in something very similar. It's going off for a couple of minutes, compiling, running multiple agents and returning full products. That to me, one of the main things that we need to be designing for is allowing humans to be active contributors in the process. And what's coming from a lot of the bigger players at the moment is this lack of giving humans that contribution element. It's seeing humans as, a checkbox ticker, an approver, but not an actual designer in a process. And I think the only way that we'll get, the ability for humans to have learner agency, be motivated, be curious, be able to reflect and grow is going to be from us actually just rethinking some of those models and taking in consideration best practice inside there. And so, yeah, I just think this is where I think educators and learning designers play a huge role. if given control to design some of their own tools to pull those principles in.
Fabulous. Peter, a lot of infrastructure and technological considerations need to happen behind the scene for all of this to go through smoothly. At the systems level, what roles can cloud infrastructure and large-scale AI ecosystems play in enabling this more personalized and pedagogical sound companions to actually hit the classrooms?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, first of all, it's going to be making sure your IT approves the use of these tools. I think so Microsoft comes
Big
in and
first step,
ensures
big first step.
exactly get that into your tenants. It's secure and private. No training is done on your data and nothing leaks out. And that's a great way to start. But also having an ecosystem play like Cogniti to actually share your learnings around creating these agents. Because what we're hearing is that, a lot of people are still figuring out how to make sure that the students are learning. And the best way to do that is to get the teachers to design and try this out. So what's great about in Cogniti, you're able to see the agents created by others, and we're looking at expanding that into putting it onto the agent store that could be accessed through Copilot chat, and you'll be able to look at all the different agents that Cogniti's produced. That way you're learning as an ecosystem from a trusted teaching and learning environment as well. So the more people that can actually share in their learnings and see how their students are doing as well and get feedback from each other, and simply doing a clone of each of those agents in your subject and see what works, it's sort of the better that we can learn together.
Fabulous. I love the conversation going around on e-bikes and, perhaps how you might use them at the end will perhaps be, telling whether you're actually using them efficiently to do more, but also get fit versus you using them passively just to get to the, end and, the escalator might be a better way to put that, Jason. But I guess, to come back to that, part of this discussion is going to be how do we ensure that students have the capacity to use these systems effectively? And that's a hard challenge. Are there lessons learned, Jason, that we can use to perhaps allow students to have better AI literacy to use these effectively?
Um, yeah, I've had a few rants about AI literacy. I'll try not to do that here. Um, uh, I think for me, having kind of looked at how this is playing out across different countries and different contexts, I think one of the issues is the way that most education systems around the world have evolved is that there's been a shift away from emphasizing the kind of work of learning and why that's important. So if you look at a lot of early childhood contexts, for example, a lot of time is spent there helping young people to understand how they manage their own learning processes, and there's lots of play and there's lots of kind of opportunities for them to develop those kinds of skills. Then we tip over into a primary school or secondary school context, and it's much more about kind of knowledge acquisition and testing, and it's a much more structured environment that doesn't necessarily give students the same level of ability to be able to learn how to navigate that environment themselves. Now, you need a combination of these things. I'm not saying that knowledge acquisition is not important, that testing's not important. Yes, these things should still be part of the system, but they need to be balanced, I think, with a set of more adaptive skills that allow students to become better learners over time. And I think that that's something that's been de-emphasized in relation to some of the other things that, like I said, are important in education, but perhaps we need to rebalance those things out. With the right set of adaptive skills in place, then what we would hope that we would see is that students will be able to adapt no matter what the world looks like tomorrow, 5 years, 10 years or 30 years. The difficulty, I think, is that we've for a long time grappled with what that cluster of skills might be. So many people here will remember the 21st century skills agenda, and that was, I think, headed in the right direction, but a lot of it became too vague to become operational. So if you look out there at definitions, for example, of critical thinking, there's hundreds of them, right? Somebody said it suffers from the toothbrush problem. It's everybody wants their own theory of critical thinking because they don't want to use anybody else's, right? So that's sort of the situation that we ended up in. I think what needs to happen here is that we need to really come to some agreement of what those key adaptive skills are, and they need to be embedded throughout education systems, and they need to be embedded right from an early age. Where we've sort of shifted too much to that testing paradigm, there should be more of that, where are my opportunities to kind of navigate my own learning embedded within that in appropriate ways. You do need some sort of explicit instruction often. Students need that explicit instruction to begin with, but we want to get to the point where they're developing their agency and making good decisions about their learning, making good judgments about how they're progressing. Then from there, with that foundation, no matter what the technology looks like, because frankly, one of my problems with AI literacy is that imagine what an AI literacy course was like in 2022. You develop that in March 2022, is completely useless today. Yet somehow we're coming up with AI literacy courses that are going to be useful in 3 years' time. I'm not convinced by that. But I think we do need to figure out what those foundational adaptive skills are. I think we've got a lot of prime candidates out there, self-regulated learning, co-regulated learning. I think these are a good starting point. Then build more of that into our education systems all the way through. That's what I'd like to see. Of course, it's easier said than done.
Aneesha, I'll come back to the comment that was posted by Steve earlier on, that it almost feels like we've got this chicken and egg problem. And you can perhaps think about it from a programming and coding perspective as you teach into first-year programming, that we really need to consider what skills the future students need to then develop AI companions that can help them with those skills. But we have uncertainty in what those skills are going to be depending on how far AI can go. So thinking about perhaps how programming as an example might look different, even 5 to 10 years from now, or even a few years from now, with CEOs of Apple and Microsoft already suggesting that over 70% of their code base they're expecting to be AI written, even by 5 years from now. How do you think we can rethink that cycle of what do future students need as skills, and how can AI companions help them achieve those skills?
So that's really interesting. And with programming code particularly, I think this is where we really look at what automation and augmentation can bring to the mix of things, okay? I know a lot of my colleagues actually go back down to programming syntax and think that is the most important skill to have our students still have, and we should focus on that as a fundamental skill. Personally, I think this is where we really need to be looking at bigger picture. There's certain technologies and certain ways of doing things before that was the only way that was possible. So we invented programming code syntax because that was the only way that we could talk to a computer. And so for some of these instances, it's okay, now we've got new methods, and it's actually looking at what skills someone needs to be adaptable, getting down to fundamentals of being able to think and reason. And that might not necessarily be doing it exactly the way we did it in the past inside there. But for me going forward, I think, again, it's designing our courses and looking forward, and it's trying to develop our students as lifelong learners. And I think something I grapple with myself is what should I offload to AI? And certain things it's going to do really well, but it's having that autonomy to make that decision about where I think I should be spending time to actually learn a few things. And I think that becomes the key skill going forward, with a lot more automation and augmentation being introduced.
Fascinating. I've picked up sort of the title of learning companions as it's something that I've been thinking quite a bit about at least in the past few months. And Jason, I've actually been using the higher education learning framework, in terms of thinking about what are perhaps some of the underlying principles that we need for such learning companions. And some of the consensus sort of that I've come up with, some colleagues working on this, is that the learning companions need to help students learn with AI rather than from AI through deep and interactive learning. So strengthening learning by building on their prior knowledge, engaging in varied cognitive tasks that expand their knowing and being. We want to have guided discovery. We want to strengthen learning by interactive supports that adapt to their learners' current ability and what they can do sort of with themselves and with some aid based on their current, so that they find it at the right level of difficulty, and it promotes resilience in terms of how they're looking at learning. We want these learning companions to help students learn to learn and give them higher order learning tasks, So that strengthens and fosters awareness, reflection, self-regulation to build autonomy and adaptability, the capacity to transfer knowledge from something that they learn to something else. We want it to be contextual, sort of strengthen learning by situating it in authentic learning environment and practices that best shape the student's identity and sort of where their work is at. And similarly, while the student is learning with AI, we think it's important that the AI needs to be learning about the student, sort of continuously adapting and modeling the learner's knowledge, strategies, and needs in meaningful ways that they can then best support them in their learning journey. Having said that, I guess to your point, this is a lot easier said than done in terms of how then do we design such companions that perhaps are lifelong companions. They're not just in one course with you or in one platform with you. Ryan Bakers, who'll be one of our panelists for the next session, essentially set a price back a few years ago about designing learning AI tools that are able to learn in one tool, in one environment, and then they can be picked up and be used elsewhere. And at least back then, this was quite a challenge in terms of how we can do this specifically. I guess let's now perhaps hear your thoughts. If you were to think about learning companions and taken that, we've designed them to be fairly broadly defined at this point. If you had to imagine a gold standard for AI learning companions of the future, what do you think they would look like? Sort of what would be some non-negotiable features that you think such AI companions should have? And maybe we can go around and each of you answer that question. Jason, maybe we'll start with you.
I've been thinking about this a lot. Where I get stuck is that I'm still not quite sure what it is that we're grappling with here. And it's coming through in some of the comments. And the way that we're still trying to use metaphors to understand what this is, I think most of us recognize that this is a tool or a technology that feels fundamentally different from what we've had in the past. Right? OpenAI a few months ago complaining about how much it's costing them for people to say please and thank you all the time because so many people are compelled to say please and thank you. We've also got people out there who are saying that they're falling in love with AI chatbots and things like this. What I think we can see fundamentally is even though this is a tool, and people like Emily Bender just say that it's a synthetic media machine that just produces random or non-random text, if you like, it's still having an impact on people that feels subjectively different. I think we've got some clues about what that mechanism is, that it's sort of hacking this thing that we do when we hear language from another agent, that we infer that there is a mind there, right? So as we're all having this here, you're hearing me and you're assuming that there is some mind, that I'm not some sort of deep fake of myself or something. I can assure you that I'm not, but I could be, right? And would we actually know the difference? So the question is, does that matter? I think that we kind of need to answer some of these fundamental questions about what fundamentally it is we're talking about here to be able to know exactly what that dynamic is going to look like in the future. We're still grappling with the basic idea of what the human-machine relationship is. And I think Aneesha's right. There is something important about how we've progressed from it being really hard to talk to computers to essentially a 3-year-old now being able to tell a computer what to do. There are so many aspects of this that I think we're still grappling with and still trying to understand. It's hard to know where the right place is for that in the future. And that's kind of why we need to do the research to figure that out, right? So thinking about what a gold standard in the future might look like is difficult from that perspective. I think it's also difficult from the perspective, and something else that I think is coming up in the chat a little bit, is that this technology is also different because it's not often centrally implemented. Peter, so you've talked a little bit about what this looks like at an enterprise level when you put a particular tool in there, but very rapidly, and part of the reason we had a problem here is that this was almost instantly a BYO type environment, right? So I might like a particular Gen AI tool, so I use another one, right? So the ability to be able to kind of control the environment or control the technology in a way as an institution or as a sector is a lot more tricky. Even where they've tried to block these things in school sectors, kids know how to set up a VPN and get around any of those blockages in about 0.2 of a second, right? So I think this is why I think there's a number of factors that create enough uncertainty for us to be able to look at this and say, oh, maybe we should hesitate a little bit here. And this is putting aside the bits of the problem here that are, this is built, a lot of these things are built on stolen intellectual property, exploitative labor practices. They weren't built for education. So there's a whole lot of kind of ethical issues that I think we have to grapple with as well. So within all of that mess, I think at the moment it's really hard for me, and I think probably anybody, to say exactly what this should look like at some point in the future. There's so many questions I think we still need to answer.
Great response. Peter, any insights from you?
Yeah, I think it's all about that collectively learning from doing. I think that's the only way to tackle this because it's just moving so fast every day, right? So, that's why with all the Cogniti guys, they're all just like learning every single day, updating with the latest models. Aneesha touched on using some of these deep research models, like GPT-5 Pro is out in API, and that's PhD level intelligence. So I think in the chat, I think we are dealing potentially with not just a tool, but something that is uniquely sort of different in this space. And you're seeing what ChatGPT is doing with Pulse, being able to proactively reach out. I mean, that sounds like something from that sci-fi movie Her, right? It's basically just going to be voice activated and actually ping you and get you out of bed, motivated throughout the day, and get you studying, hopefully, and enriching yourself, and not necessarily so that you can just get a job that you don't actually want to work in. So all of those pillars are, hopefully, it's enhancing our humanity. At the same time, these companions will be all about, I think, eventually enriching us as we go through those Maslow's hierarchy of needs, not necessarily coupling it with income and getting the job. Like, I think that those days are quickly coming towards some sort of wall that we're seeing in terms of what we can achieve with these solutions. Yeah, so I think definitely learn from doing. Either try it out, all those tools. Just make sure that, yeah, like Jason said, there's the shadow IT is going to happen anyway. So you might as well make the tools that are IT approved easier to use. And that's why we're incorporating these Azure AI solutions into Teams. We're integrating with your LMS solutions so that it's easier to access right there, whether it's Moodle, D2L, Canvas. Like, just make it as simple to use and compliant to use as you can, because students are very fickle. They can just bring whatever they want. And that's before the devices come out. You see, like even OpenAI is coming up with Johnny Ive, something that will be a new platform standard as a front end to your smartphones or your laptops, purely based on this conversational AI and being proactively reaching you out. And the latest Dev Day that just had yesterday, it's becoming the everything app. So the applications are getting, I guess, dematerialized, because all of that will be contained in these UI for AI type of co-pilot type of scenarios. So that's the future we're dealing with, and the only way to do it is learn from doing. Get it in there. I popped in the chat. Try it now.
Aneesha, what's on your wish list for future AI companions?
Okay, so I think something, and this is more, so obviously I've transitioned back to being an academic, but personally something I grappled with as well, because I honestly love to learn and continue growing. And that's been a key thing for me, like throughout my career, just being able to understand new concepts and then apply them. And so for me, it's one, trying to think about what I need going forward, and then the skills I need to use this, and then how I can actually equip my students to do it. Now, I like to think of these large language models and then their chatbot user interfaces as just being large fuzzy matches across a really large set of knowledge that can then do composition on it. And so most likely it's something that was seen before that can be combined in new ways. And a lot of the way they actually converse with us and what they're able to do is because we've trained them to do so. So they've been trained to be really pleasing. They've been trained to give direct answers and be to the point, and things like that. And this is where I think we should be looking at training our own models with input from, researchers from learning sciences and putting resources to that. But then that leads us to, what would make a good learning companion? And so to me, it's things like having a better set of diverse pedagogical tutor moves. All right. So there's, human tutors use a variety of ways to get students to understand things and get to a point without necessarily giving a direct answer. A big part of this is actually going to be balancing confusion and frustration. And because humans learn best when there is some form of productive failure. And this seems to be the element that we're really missing at the moment with being able to get the direct answers. And it's possibly why a lot of the research studies show that if you take away the augmentation, people have not picked up the skill set. And so they're forever going to be augmented in that regard. We need, better contribution, collaborative models where people actually can contribute instead of getting these to do entire workflows of things. Feedback. I want a learning companion that actually can give me feedback, but make sure that I personally act on that feedback and I'm not just getting it to go, thank you for your feedback. Now you go and do the work for me. Just the notion of what feedback actually is as a learner, I think is being lost because learners are, give me feedback and now you go and do it for me. And so that idea of being act is being completely lost. And finally, self-regulation. I want a learning companion that actually helps me regulate my learning. I think the worst use of AI is when you've got a deadline looming. And for me personally, and as for my students, if you've got a deadline looming, something that can give a direct answer is going to give you something that you're just going to take and use. And so that idea of self-regulated learning becomes really important in pacing people to then do the checks and actively contribute side of it.
Really, really good points. Whenever I think about sort of a learning companion, exactly the same framing you had, Aneesha, is I think about, what if I had a teacher in the classroom? What if I had an educator working with a student? What are some of the aspects that we can perhaps try to resemble in a learning companion, and where we would have gaps in terms of needing to complement what that learning companion can do with an actual educator, a peer, or someone else sort of to fill those gaps? We have a bit more time. I want to change gear a little bit. So far we've talked about, learning companions in terms of good learning, and we looked at health, for example, as a framework. But there's also a need to develop learning companions that are trustworthy, that are ethical, that they are inclusive. And, there's various ways to, I guess, define what those would look like. So designing learning companions trustworthy, perhaps they operate reliably, they're safe to use, they are using your data in meaningful ways, and your privacy aspects are considered. Ethical in terms of embodying moral and pedagogical values and promoting well-being, preventing cognitive and emotional harm to individuals or to society. And from an inclusive perspective, to serve the needs of all learners and actively trying to mitigate bias and bridging the digital divides. Any thoughts from any of you in terms of how do we actually bring in these other factors into designing our learning companions?
I mean, some of those design choices that we're working through right now with Western Sydney, for example, they know that the demographic that they're targeting for future students is going to have to be, the lowest common denominator. So we want to make sure that that diversity is there baked in by design. And it was the same process for UTS. They wanted to make sure that it was multimodal by default. And these are the sort of things that, see, it's not just the students, but the teachers, the researchers, all of this goes into how the future of design and of AI is actually going to be doing. So the UTS, the Center for AI Humanities Center, that's right, with Peter and Simon Buckinghamshire. So they've sort of really used this as a catalyst to see how they're designing their AI solutions going forward.
And a quick hi to Simon, as I think he's in the audience. Jason and Aneesha, any thoughts on that?
So one thing for me that comes to mind that I particularly don't think going to a corporate solution actually helps with is bringing in our cultural perspectives and our indigenous perspectives, because the training data that's used inherently on these models just does not contain it. And there definitely, I think needs to be sovereign AI that might be developed across different nations to actually start to incorporate this that then can then be used.
Jason?
Okay, how not to rant. But look, the bottom line is that these are technologies and tools that have been built to make money for people who are largely already billionaires, etc. Right? Like, I think we just have to be clear about that. They haven't been built in order to do some sort of altruistic thing to manage to help with learning. So that leaves us in a situation where there needs to be, I think, a balance between regulation and innovation. And if we tip too much in either direction, there's a significant risk there, right? So we need some regulation in place because these are not, again, these are not tools that are made for education. So we've got to make sure that all of our students are protected, that they have rights, that their voice is heard. All of these are absolutely critical and fundamental to having a good education system. But at the same time, we also need to have enough space in there to be able to actually figure out where this technology might be useful. So for me, I think it's always worth keeping that tension in mind. And part of that equation, for better or worse, has to be that we've got to have the right guardrails in place. We've got to have the right regulation in place. And that looks very different around the world. So part of the challenge I think that we all have collectively in this webinar is that we need to be able to share our learnings on both of those fronts, because I think globally that's how we get our education systems to a point where we get the maximum value out of these technologies. But it has to be a balance of both of those things. You know, like I said, the bottom line is that these are not inherently educational tools. So they're being retrofit in, and we've got to make sure that the right framing is around that for that to happen in a way that is done ethically and the right way that will actually have, you know, some benefit for students.
Some quick final reflections. Jason, perhaps one thing educators should remember when they're thinking about AI and learning?
Perhaps going back to where I started, that learning is a process, and the process, you know, actually spending the effort on it, which I think is a theme that's come up a few times here, is just so important no matter what the future might look like. You know, the brain's not exactly like a muscle, but the harder you work it, the better it gets at being able to do new problems and solve new challenges and those sorts of things. And I hope that we never lose that. You know, in fact, I think we probably need to emphasize that more.
Aneesha, one principle tool designers should adopt.
I think we should be designing our tools to actually incorporate different collaboration models that actually bring the learner into the process and allow them to actually see their contribution, even if AI is being used inside there. And I guess I'll add one more thing, which is for educators, is that I really think we should be teaching for lifelong learning skills. And this does not necessarily mean when we concentrate on fundamentals that we should not forbid the use of AI. I think it's this learning to work and learn with AI is going to be something that's now with us continuously for the rest of our lives. And, you know, I think some of the best things I share with my students, because they also have a lot of uncertainty about the future. They're, you know, enrolled at university doing 3 or 4 year degree programs, but they're uncertain of what their future roles are going to look like. And so I think a lot of my students just really appreciate it, is to share how to think about things, how to continue being productive, how to be part of the process. And as educators, even in our own roles, we're all grappling with, you know, what do we offload to these tools? What do we still need to be doing? And I think we should be sharing that a lot more.
Fabulous. And Peter, one step institutions can take today to prepare for future.
Yeah, just same message around collectively learn from doing. I see Simon's popped a link to the UTS recast AI assistance there. So just get started. And I think the quickest way, you know, something like a Cogniti, just to start learning from doing. What would you basically say to your future self as well, like you're preaching to the students? It's that lifelong learning. So gotta continue to do that, and hopefully channel your inner Ethan Mollick and get playing around with these things.
Fabulous. To close, we've started talking about, I think, including the important concepts of learning companions. And if we want AI to truly advance education, we feel like we must move beyond productivity tools to learning companions grounded in the learning sciences and the hard-won lessons in AI education and 40 years of developing such intelligent tutoring systems. Moving past chat agents optimized for task completion and short-term gains towards ethical, equitable companions embedded in our digital learning environments, where students learn with AI through deep engagement, guided challenging, reflections, frustration, while AI learns about the students and adapts transparently to their needs over time. This hopefully enables us to develop systems where performance follows from learning, not the other way around. And at the same time, it's going to be critical to think about designing these companions in ways that they're trustworthy, they're ethical, they're inclusive, to have benefits for every learner and the society. I want to thank you for your engagement, for all the wonderful chat and discussions that was happening in the chat and also on Whova. And thanks once again to our distinguished panelists for the session. I wish you all the best for today and night, wherever you are, and all the best with the rest of the conference as well. Thanks, everyone.